Hello and welcome to the DVB Newsroom. I'm Nora. I'm joined in studio by Ashley South, the author of Conflict, Complexity and Climate Change, Emergent Federal Systems and Resilient in Post-coup Myanmar. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
The UN Climate Change Conference, COP29, was held in Baku, Azerbaijan. What is the COP and did anyone represent Myanmar at COP?
Well, COP stands for Chief of Parties. So this is the 29th time that world leaders have come together at a UN climate change conference to identify the risks, but I think particularly look at some of the different adaptation and mitigation activities that can help to address the challenges of climate change. The COP27 conference was held in Glasgow in the UK, and that was just after the February 2021 coup. And the SAC junta tried to attend that conference, and I'm glad to say they were not allowed to attend because, as we know, the SAC is illegal and illegitimate. Last year, there was no Myanmar representation at the COP. This year, Myanmar is represented through a team from Korthule, which is the Karen Free State in Myanmar, as I'm sure you know. So the situation we have at the moment is that Myanmar has developed a nationally determined contribution plan. That was actually put together by the previous NLD government. And at the COP27th meeting in Glasgow, both the SAC and the National Unity Government, Ministry of Natural Resources, both submitted a Myanmar nationally determined contribution plan to the Glasgow conference. That plan is rather top-down, state-centric. There was very little consultation, and it's actually the same plan that was submitted by both the SAC and the NUG. So at this year's COP29 in Azerbaijan, we're presenting, or actually on Monday, we presented the Korthule Climate Action Plan, which includes a Korthule nationally determined contribution. So to answer your question, Myanmar is not directly represented at the COP, but Korthule, which is the sovereign independent Karen state, is represented with our own climate action plan.
Myanmar is known as the second most climate vulnerable country in the world. What does that mean exactly?
Well, we're primarily looking at vulnerability to climate change in the form of changing rainfall patterns and temperature. One of the reasons why Myanmar is regarded as so vulnerable is because nearly 200,000 people were killed in 2008 during Cyclone Nargis, and so those numbers, of course, those appalling loss of life is part of the reason why Myanmar tops many of the tables regarding vulnerability. I think there's two main factors. So one would be changing temperature patterns. And at the moment, temperatures in Myanmar are about 1.5, 2 degrees above historic averages. The future of temperature in Myanmar will depend mostly on global carbon dioxide emissions. So if I may, I can talk a bit more later about some of the interventions that can be made both to adapt to climate change and also to try and slow down climate change. But with the current trajectory globally of carbon dioxide emissions, I think we're only just seeing the beginning of it. It seems likely that temperatures will increase very significantly in Myanmar over the coming 1 or 2 decades, and that's going to be accompanied by what we have seen already in the last couple of years, which is increasingly unpredictable rainfall patterns, with the rainy season usually starting later, sometimes finishing earlier. This year the rainy season is still dragging on in some parts of the country, and so with those unpredictable rainfall patterns, that usually means more rain falling in a shorter period of time, so that leads to some of the widespread flooding that we've seen. And the third aspect, which is really quite an unknown, but it's definitely a risk factor out there, would be rising sea levels as well, which could have really negative impacts particularly in coastal areas and in the Irrawaddy Delta. So yeah, Myanmar is really very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The other thing is, because more than half of the population, by some estimates it's as much as 3/4 of the working population in Myanmar is involved in agriculture, and agriculture is going to be particularly hard hit by the impacts of climate change. So I think that's another reason why Myanmar is vulnerable. And then finally, of course, governments around the world it's I would say too little too late, but climate action is moving up the agenda. Most states are beginning to take adaptation and mitigation seriously, whereas, of course, Myanmar is without a government. There is an illegal and illegitimate junta that seems to be mostly focusing on plundering natural resources, destroying the environment and killing the civilian population. So I think the combination of threats and a government that is not taking its responsibilities seriously explain why Myanmar is particularly vulnerable.
Since the 2021 military coup, how has the conflict that has resulted caused complexity when it comes to dealing with climate change?
Well, it is complex, and not just in Myanmar but around the world. There's a lot of discussion and reports on the linkages between conflict and climate change, and the linkages are certainly there, but it's not a simple cause and effect relationship. I guess what kind of might bring it home would be an example that helped me to realise how these things are linked. I was travelling in Karen areas in January this year, and talking to farmers who had lost their crops as a result of the flooding last year in the eastern Baku region, and of course even worse, the flooding this year. But last year, and the farmers were telling me that they could not prevent their crops being destroyed because of the flooding, climate change. You might remember that May, June 2023, there was very intense downpours, unseasonal flooding. But also the flooding was particularly damaging because the farmers could not get into the fields and repair their irrigation systems. And the reason they couldn't repair the irrigation systems was because of the armed conflict and fear of airstrikes and violence from the Myanmar army. So I think it's an example of how climate change and conflict come together. In this particular occasion, in June and July, the rice farms in the area I visited were very, very badly affected. Most of the rice seedlings were destroyed, but the local farmers replanted with a different rice variety, and they managed to get an okay harvest, I think, last year. So that introduces another really important part of this, which is the bottom-up approach, which is so essential to climate change action, that it was actually farmers without any outside support, using their own resources, their own knowledge, actually choosing a climate change adapted type of seed to replant and achieve some success. So yeah, I think that's a really good example of climate and conflict linkages, but also how the solutions are often really to be found at the local level.
What are the risks of international climate funding being misappropriated by the junta? How can this be mitigated?
Right. Well, my view is that there should be no international climate funds going anywhere near the SAC junta. I think the junta is illegal and illegitimate, and so in that case, where does climate action come from? I would say that particularly in the post-coup context, we do see new political structures arising in Myanmar. I mean, I've written a bit about this, and of course many people are talking now about emergent federalism. And so we can see in Karen areas, Kachin areas, and many other ethnic nationality populated parts of the country that ethnic armed organizations, civil society actors, local communities are coming together to manage their own lives in the fields of health and education and also climate action. So I think one part of the answer to that is to say that really support needs to be redirected towards these local climate actors. And that should be in line with international climate finance priorities. I mean, if we look at some of the recent declarations, and I expect we will see more coming out of the present COP29 in Azerbaijan, there is a strong commitment by climate donors to work at the subnational level. I think we know from other sectors, for example, disaster risk reduction, that effective action is much more likely to reach communities if it is delivered at the local level. In Myanmar, where we have an illegal central government that is quite incapable of this work, I think that it really presents a strong opportunity to work with subnational authorities such as the Karen National Union, the Kachin Independence Organisation, and then also state-level bodies, for example, the Karenni State Consultative Council, the Ta'ang Political Consultative Council. All of these bodies have fairly high levels of capacity, strong intention to work on these issues, but they don't have the technical or financial support they need. So if international climate finance is serious about working at the subnational level, I think Myanmar is the perfect opportunity. Plus, there's a lot of talk about the need to work in conflict-affected countries, but most climate finance still goes to middle-income countries. And of course, Myanmar are very highly conflict-affected. So I think it's actually almost a challenge for the international climate finance industry. There's billions of dollars that have been committed to adaptation and mitigation in conflict-affected countries. There is a desire to work at the subnational level, and I think Myanmar is ready to receive those funds. I mean, I mentioned earlier that at the COP conference, the Kothule Environmental Conservation Committee, Protection Committee, sorry, the KEPC, is represented, so it means that the KNU, the Karen National Union, is represented at the COP conference. We have a 10-year plan, the Kothule Climate Action Plan, which is a pretty sophisticated strategy of a range of different climate change adaptation activities and also mitigation activities, very much based in community consultations, working with CSOs and with the Karen National Union. And we were very excited to present that at the, my colleagues presented it at the COP conference. And I think this is a really good example of a climate action plan that could definitely be supported. It will need substantial technical and financial input. We're ready to go. And, you know, the forests of Kothule, Kachinland, other parts of Myanmar as well, of course, these are some of the best remaining forests in mainland Southeast Asia. So really globally important for climate change mitigation, by which I mean that the trees draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and then it's sequestered in the ground through roots and mycelial systems. So we really do hope that the globally important contribution of Kothule forests will be recognised, and the KNU, the CSOs, working on this project, and particularly communities, are very much committed to protecting the natural heritage. And they've been doing that for centuries with indigenous sustainable livelihoods and forest management. So that's beginning to be recognised. Great. We really feel that with the right support, we can make a globally important contribution to climate change mitigation, and at the same time support sustainable indigenous adaptation practices. So while the possibility of working through central government authorities in Myanmar, I think, is almost impossible after the coup. The NUG is mostly government in exile and certainly has very little mandate when it comes to natural resources government. And of course the SAC is an illegal criminal junta. So I really think it is time that the custodians of the forest, who have been managing responsibly these resources for many, many centuries, should be given the support they need to keep doing that in the context of a vicious civil war.
UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, released a report called No Escape on the Front Lines of Climate Change, Conflict and Forced Displacement. How does conflict and forced displacement play a role in climate change in Myanmar?
Well, a few ways, I think. Probably the most significant is impacts on food security.
Sure.
So we are already, I think, beginning to see the first really negative impacts on rice and other crops because of the changing temperatures. I mentioned earlier about the impacts of shifting rainfall patterns, and that's very damaging for lowland agriculture, irrigated rice farming, which can be flooded, but also intense rainpour during the particularly in the early and late parts of the planting season, can really devastate upland farming as well. Combined with rising temperatures, which seem very likely to inhibit the yield and to decrease the productivity of existing rice production, I think we are moving probably quite quickly into a situation where there will be widespread food insecurity in Myanmar. I think there is still time to do something about it with the right kind of adaptation strategies. So that would mean listening to farmers, working with farmers, establishing peer-to-peer learning, maybe through farmer field schools, and then introducing new seed types, new growing strategies, maybe sometimes even new crops. So I think there is an opportunity for adaptation. But unless that is supported, I think we are moving into a situation of climate-induced displacement. It's going to be particularly difficult in the central lowland areas, so the dry zone, the Anya, Sagaing, Magwe and Mandalay regions. There's about 12 million people who live in this area, and the projections for future temperatures in the central dry zone are really quite terrifying. Basically, human beings cannot survive beyond 35 degrees centigrade for very long, and the average daily temperatures in these areas are almost 35 degrees centigrade already. That includes day and nighttime temperatures. This year there were several days when the dry zone was above 40 degrees centigrade, and I believe there were several hundred climate-induced deaths, heat stress deaths. The projections do depend on future carbon dioxide emissions globally, but it looks quite likely that within 10 to 20 years there could be 30, 40, 50 days a year above 40 degrees centigrade in the dry zone. Human beings cannot survive under those circumstances. So unless there is widespread access to air conditioning, which seems not very realistic or likely, then it really seems that many communities in the dry zone will have very little choice. The first, I think there will be a collapse in food security, but human beings cannot survive in those conditions. So that's going to drive migration. I think probably other countries will be faced with similar crises, but in Myanmar, the humanitarian and political implications of 12 million people in the dry zone no longer being able to survive as human beings, I think are massive and have really important implications for the coherence of the state of Myanmar over the rest of this century.
So what environmental initiatives exist among displaced communities?
Among displaced communities, of course, it's really tough because IDPs often, they have to really look out for basic survival and security. And I think this is one of the issues which globally and in Myanmar has maybe prevented climate action being prioritised as much as it should be. I sometimes have the opportunity to talk to political leaders, EAO and other leaders, and I think there's a widespread recognition now that this is a serious issue. Particularly on the ground, I think we can see the beginning of crop failure and heat exhaustion. So commanders in the field are, I think, aware of this, and political leaders. But of course, there are so many different priorities, air strikes, political priorities. There's a lot to think about. And in that context, I think we do need to do all we can to push climate change to the top of the agenda. But your question was about displaced communities, and it's very difficult. For example, Karenni State, there were recent reports of many displaced people settlement being affected by flooding. I think there were some deaths. In the dry season, it's going to be terribly difficult in Karenni because I think it is the state which has the least available groundwater. So it's going to be very hot and thirsty for many people. What can be done is to protect existing forests, to plant new forests. I mean, that's a long-term approach, but particularly adaptation. So that's much easier for non-displaced communities. For people who are displaced already, they face massive food insecurity. So I think it's a really good question that needs to be thought through by humanitarian actors, but also by political authorities, because the question of how displaced communities can be supported to adapt to climate change in their very difficult circumstances should really, I think, be part of a bigger question in terms of really thinking about strategies regarding climate change adaptation and mitigation. These need to be, in my opinion, and I think this is backed by the evidence, need to be mainstreamed by policymakers and power holders.
Sure. Your book looks at the emergent federal systems being established by ethnic nationalities in Myanmar since the 2021 coup. What role does this play in mitigating the effects of climate change?
So I think mitigation and adaptation, I think there's a few different ways that emergent federal systems are important in this conversation. Partly it's about localization. There's a principle in federalism, subsidiarity, which demands that decisions should be taken and resources should be distributed at the lowest possible level, closest to the ground, because that's where action is most effective. And so in emergent federalism, a bottom-up approach, political authorities are established at township, district level, let's say, certainly at the subnational level. They are from the affected communities. They are much more closely linked to the affected communities than distant administrations in Naypyidaw or elsewhere. So I think in practical terms, this is important. But the other part of it is that the natural resources of Myanmar have been destroyed, pillaged by successive central governments, really going back to the British colonial period, that are not the owners of these resources. And I think an emergent approach to federalism really is based on the sovereignty of the ethnic nations that have been brought together by previous colonial administrations to form the state of Myanmar. I think that state of Myanmar is now collapsing. So my argument would be that sovereignty and legitimate authority now rests with the ethnic and other nations that have made up the country. And these are, for example, in the case of the two groups I mentioned, particularly the Karen National Union, the Kachin Independence Organisation, these are organisations with very deep ideological, normative commitments and values to the preservation of indigenous cultures and ways of life. So I think they've just got much more stake in the game. I think it's much more likely that local ethnic nationality administrations coming from the areas in question, they have much more of a sense of stewardship rather than exploitation of natural resources.
How do Myanmar's climate challenges impact the broader region? I mean, its neighboring countries?
Yeah, no, very good question. Yeah, I think in a few different ways. Right now, I guess flooding and seasonal haze are probably the most important. I think in the future, we have to come back to this question of climate refugees and IDPs, and I think there are going to be a very large number of people in lowland areas of Myanmar in particular with nowhere to live, and that's going to raise real questions about cross-border migration and people who are fleeing because they can no longer sustain their lives, I think should be recognised as climate refugees. But in the shorter term, I guess we're talking about flooding and particularly seasonal haze. So we're doing this interview in Chiang Mai, and what a wonderful city Chiang Mai is, but pretty uncomfortable place to live February, March, April when it gets hot and smoggy and we have to lock ourselves indoors, those of us who are privileged enough to have that option. And there are a number of different factors that make up the smog, but part of it is unregulated agricultural burn-off. And intriguingly, if you look at a map of fire spots across Southeast Asia in March and April, these are one of the main drivers of the seasonal fog. And there are hundreds of fires all over Thailand, southern China, Laos and Myanmar. But some parts of Myanmar have far fewer wildfires or even controlled fires, and so contribute much less smoke to the seasonal haze. And the areas which have fewer fires and make less smoke tend to be the ones which are managed by indigenous communities. And the best example of that would be the Salween Peace Park, which is a 21,000 square kilometre indigenous peace park established by communities and the Karen National Union and Kisan in northern Karen state. And just next month, a new national park will be opened up in the Taungoo district, which will extend this protected area even further, right through the northern Karen hills. And this Salween Peace Park and the To'u Thothi Indigenous Park are home to some of the most important biodiversity in mainland Southeast Asia, everything from tigers to teak trees. But also because of the sustainable natural resources management, they produce much less smoke each year. And you can really see that on some of the satellite photos. There are gaps in the smoke, and those gaps tend to be the places where Karen upland villages are sustainably managing the environment. So I think there's a really important contribution there of Korthule to addressing the seasonal haze challenge in Myanmar. And similarly, a lot of the flooding that we have seen recently, it's partly changing rainfall patterns. It's exacerbated by widespread logging, which reduces the ability of hills and forests to retain water and leads to sort of quick runoff and flash floods. So by preserving the environment in Thailand and in Myanmar, we can contribute towards limiting flooding. And as some of the floodwater comes through the Moy and Salween rivers and from the hills of Myanmar, by supporting indigenous climate action in Burma, I think that can limit the flooding experience and impacts on neighbouring countries like Thailand.
Next year, COP30 will be held in Brazil. Do you see any changes in Myanmar over the next 12 months?
So, in terms of the COP process, not really. It seems to me that the UNFCCC process through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports has failed, really. It looks like the world has not taken seriously the challenge. But I'm not a climate scientist. My PhD is in humanitarian politics. But my understanding is that the IPCC reports, which I have read quite thoroughly, and are very, very frightening. Anyone who's read those reports should be worried. But in fact, they're too conservative, and the actual changes will, I think, be even more significant than what we read in the IPCC reports, partly because the IPCC reports don't take account of methane release, they don't take account of melting ice caps, and I think they have a rather conservative view of future temperature changes. In Myanmar, though, I think we will certainly see the collapse of food security across the country, particularly but not only in lowland areas. I wouldn't like to say that's going to happen in the next 12 months. It's kind of difficult to know. In terms of what happens politically to Myanmar, also, I certainly don't have a crystal ball. I find it very, very difficult to imagine that anything looking like a central government can be re-established in Naypyidaw, whether that is under the SAC junta, who I certainly regard as evil and illegitimate. They should all be in jail. But it's very difficult to imagine any future government regime really being able to impose centralised rule in a context particularly of the climate chaos that is almost inevitable in the coming years. So I do think the combination of conflict and climate change are going to drive more and more an awareness that what I'm calling for now subnational political authorities, but I think they're really kind of sovereign state authorities in Korthule, in Kachinland, in Ta'angland, in Monland, etc. I think more and more it will become obvious that these are the most legitimate political actors, the most effective military actors, and the most promising climate action and mitigation actors. Whether the international community can get the support in time, I think, is questionable. We've seen pretty limited support to the Spring Revolution so far, so I'm not really confident that climate finance will be any more innovative. But so in terms of what the situation might look like a year from now, I hope that we might see the beginning of some innovative funding arrangements that would actually allow resources to reach the local communities that need it, because there's a lot now that can be done to save the remaining forests and to adapt to the impacts of climate change, but it needs resources which have not yet been delivered. And of course then the larger context of the armed conflict, my personal view would be that it's likely to drag on for some time. I cannot see the SAC winning, but also it's kind of difficult to see what the end game would look like at this point. I suspect that actually the question is going to change in the coming years. I think the conflict is almost a given, and the question is more, what are the impacts of climate change?
So before we conclude, is there anything else you would like to add?
I guess it's about climate justice at the end of the day. I mean, we know that Myanmar is highly vulnerable to climate change, but has done so little to contribute towards the carbon dioxide emissions that are driving increasing temperatures. And within Myanmar, of course, the ethnic communities that have been subject to state violence for centuries and have had their resources extracted, they also have done nothing to contribute towards these massive existential threats. So I would say that just in terms of climate justice, it's time to think about how to support indigenous communities in Myanmar, and also effectiveness, because indigenous communities, I hope that's come across from my words today, but I would encourage viewers to check out the Korthule Climate Action Plan. It will be available publicly end of the year, early next year at the latest. And you will see that there's a very well thought out 10-year plan there, which I think is quite some way in advance of anything the SAC is thinking of, but I think also it can serve as a sort of not a blueprint for other ethnic nations, because the kind of federalism that we see emerging in the current context is very asymmetrical, so climate action will look different in different areas. But I hope that at least if we can get some support for the Kothule Climate Action Plan, it may encourage other ethnic communities to believe that they are not abandoned by the international community, because it does kind of feel like Burma is mostly abandoned by the international community, particularly when it comes to climate change. So I hope that, yes, my friends and colleagues' presentation at the COP conference, and then the work of the KNU and Karen CSOs to develop a Kothule Climate Action Plan can be seen as significant, because the window of opportunity to address these issues is rapidly closing, and the time for action is now.
So thank you for coming to our
Thank you.
newsroom and sharing your valuable insights.